So thank you for attending this webinar to learn about survival by degrees, 389 bird species on the brink. I will be talking about the fate of North America's birds in a changing climate and what we at Audubon found out in our report that came out in October. Before I dive into the science and a little bit of a background on climate change, I just wanted to highlight that we obviously are going through a kind of unprecedented time right now with the pandemic that we're going through. I personally have found a lot of solace in nature during this time, particularly as we have to stay in place, and in birds. And so every morning I'm listening to the birds that I'm hearing outside, and I don't know if anybody else here has connected with nature or with birds in particular, but I just wanted to keep in mind as I talk about this, think about the birds that you hear in your neighborhood, the ones that maybe you are really come to life to you in your mind as I talk about this, because it's more than just the science. It's also about our sense of place and the birds that we have come to love and know. So climate is said to be one of the biggest issues of our time. We've heard from the youth that they don't want their future compromised. And back in November, over 11,000 scientists globally signed a paper declaring climate, it's a climate emergency and a climate crisis. So here we're looking at how global temperatures have continued to rise. Of the 17 hottest years ever recorded, 16 have now occurred since 2000. And temperatures over the entire Earth's continents and oceans in 2016 were about 1.1 degrees Celsius, or nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit above the pre-industrial average. So that means we're already at the majority of the way of warming to this 1.5 degree goal that was set at the Paris Agreement in 2015. So you can see here through time how much warmer the planet is getting, particularly as we approach to the 2020s. So this is looking at carbon dioxide as parts per million in the atmosphere from 800,000 years before present to our current timeline. And what this is showing is that greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide, are a natural part of our atmosphere. There's something that allows life on Earth. It helps keep that heat in the atmosphere so that we can have life on Earth. But if you have too much of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, less heat can escape into space, and more heat is brought back into our atmosphere. So the more carbon dioxide you have, the higher the temperatures are on our planet. And you can see here that the average we're having is about 407 parts per million, which is much higher than the highest previous concentration of 300 parts per million. And so here is just how we see the rise of temperatures from the pre-industrial averages into current time period related to the parts per million. And you can see there's a very strong correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So how do greenhouse gases warm our planet? I just wanted to show the different greenhouse gases that we have. So the left is looking at carbon dioxide and then the relative amount of warming of the other greenhouse gases compared to carbon dioxide. So methane is 25 times more heat trapping than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more, and fluorinated gases are thousands of times more than carbon dioxide. But if you look at how much is in the atmosphere, you can see that carbon dioxide makes up 76%, where some of the other ones are a lot smaller. One of the things I also want to note is that although some of the other greenhouse gases are more potent, they don't stay in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide will stay in the atmosphere for 1,000 or more years. And so what that is showing is that the carbon dioxide we're putting into our atmosphere now from our different pollutions is going to stay there for a really long time. So the more we put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the harder it is going to be to rein in climate change in the future because of this extended effect of how long it lasts in the atmosphere. So this is looking at the long-term temperature anomaly from the paleo record as well. And so models predict that the Earth will warm between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius in the next century. When global warming has happened at various times in the past 2 million years, it has taken the planet about 5,000 years to warm 5 degrees. So the predicted rate of warming for the next century alone is 20 times faster. So this rate of change is really unusual. And I wanted to talk about this because people always ask me, well, hasn't the Earth been through climate change before? Of course it has. Haven't birds dealt with climate change before? Yes, they have. In their evolutionary history, birds have dealt with climate change before. But what they haven't dealt with is the pace of climate change. Like I said, this rate of change is extremely unusual. And what it's doing is it's causing changes so rapidly that it's going to be really hard for birds to kind of keep track with these changes with this rapid pace. So that's one thing that's really different. The next thing that I really want to orient people to is that the landscape is very different than it was before people arrived. And so this is looking at housing density in the 1940s. The darker the green to almost the black means very wild areas. The more lighter colors you get more housing density until you get to the red areas. These are the urban areas. And so we're looking at 1940, 1950, 60, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And so what you can see over this time period is that we've lost a lot of our natural areas. There's been a very strong urbanization effect, particularly in the eastern part of the US and parts of the far west coast. But if you look even at the projections into the 2030s, that even starts to erode in the west. And so what I'm saying is the landscape is very, very different because of people on the landscape. And so what a bird might have in the past come and seen a native prairie or an intact forest system, they're now met with monocultures of agriculture or large housing developments. And so these areas that they might have been able to shift or move to with climate change or use as habitat refuge places, it's not the same anymore. So they're going to struggle to find appropriate habitat. So they're having to deal with moving at a fast rate, climate change happening at a fast rate, and a human-dominated system that makes it hard for them to find natural habitats. So how is climate change affecting birds now? And so this is just a little a cartoon that talks about how grassland birds might be shifting up mountains because of climate change. That's one of the first things people think about with changes in climate, that our mountain systems are changing. But we've actually seen quite a lot of changes with birds in the historic amount of climate change that we've already seen. So first, I want to highlight that egg laying dates are changing. So eggs laying is occurring earlier. One large-scale study showed that birds are laying eggs up to 6.5 days earlier per decade. North American tree swallows are nesting up to 9 days earlier than they did 30 years ago. And this is corresponding to an increase in average spring temperatures. And in some locations, bald eagles are nesting up to 6 weeks earlier in the Midwest. And this is because there's a reduced duration and extent of ice cover in some areas like the Great Lakes due to climate change. And so because of this, the eagles are able to have earlier access to foraging along the lakes, which does initiate like an earlier egg laying and nesting by the eagles. This is a really interesting study that came out recently that talks about how birds' body sizes are actually changing because of climate change. A broad study that looked at North American migratory birds has found that they've actually been shrinking through the decades. And this is likely a result of a warming climate. So their bodies have gotten smaller. They've also developed longer wings. And people have hypothesized that this, as the planet warms, we're going to be seeing these trends of decreasing body size so that they can deal with these warmer temperatures. So this is interesting that we're already seeing this signal in birds in North America. Birds are migrating earlier as well. This was a broad study that came out in the fall. And this is actually a really interesting study because they didn't look at individual birds. They looked at radar data. And so I don't know how many people are familiar with the fact that you can use radar data from the Doppler radar to see bird migration. So it used to be considered just noise in the radar data, but they're actually finding that you can really see when tons of birds take off at the same time. You can also do it for big insect swarms. I've seen it looking at monarch migration patterns as well. But when they looked at this radar ecology data across hundreds of species, they found that birds were migrating earlier in the spring based on these warming temperatures, that spring is coming earlier, it's getting warmer. And so we're seeing across the board, birds are responding to climate change and changing the long patterns of migration that they've held for thousands of years. Birds in their environment are also becoming mismatched. And so much of the bird's life cycle and behavior is very closely linked to cues from the environment, like changing of seasons. And so a mismatch occurs when a bird cannot shift their behavior, such as breeding times, enough to coincide with changes in the environment, such as when its prey is available. And so here we're looking at the arrival time of birds in the 1850s versus the 2010s. And what we're finding is that in some cases, birds are arriving, they're being cued by the environment to show up at a particular time. So in the past, they would have arrived before the leaves start to leaf out because they're cued by the temperatures, and so they start to leaf out and then the flowers come. And so the reason why this is important is because when the plants start to leaf out, that's when there starts to be insects available. And when the insects are available is when the birds they need that to start feeding their young, because 96% of land birds feed insects to their young. So what happens now that spring is happening earlier, the birds are a little bit mismatched. So they're arriving after that leaf out. And so what happens is that they might not actually arrive at the correct time. And so they're arriving, they're laying their eggs, and their phenology is out of sync with when the most abundant caterpillars are for their young is. And so here is just showing how they're actually laying eggs when the abundance of caterpillars has peaked earlier because of this change in temperature. And so when their young need it most, there's less insects around. So it's really causing problems in birds in terms of their breeding behavior. Entire communities are also becoming disrupted. So when you first look at this slide, this might look like snow or garbage on the shores, but these are actually dead seabirds. These are in tens of thousands of dead seabirds. In 2016, there was a mass seabird of common murres that washed up on the beaches of Alaska. There's also been several more mass seabird die-offs, including with puffins since then. And so these used to be things that would happen once every couple of decades. They're now happening every year. And what they're finding is that there have been large ocean heat waves that have caused changes in the entire ecosystem of these areas where the fish are changing. So some of the fish are diving deeper to escape the cold temperatures. Some of the larger body fish are moving into different areas. And so what's happening with these birds is that they're actually starving because their entire ecosystem is broken. They're not having the appropriate fish species that they need to prey on. And another thing that's been happening actually quite often is that species distributions are changing. These are just a couple of examples of species that we know have already been shifting their ranges. Carolina wren, this is one that my father is actually a birder. He's been feeding his birds in his backyard for 40 years. And a couple of years ago, he said to me, oh, I've got this new feeder bird. It's showing up more often and it's not supposed to be here. And it's actually the Carolina wren. This is a species that science studies have shown that it's shifting its range northward in winter because winters are becoming more mild. And so that's just an example of where birders can pay attention to the birds that are in their own backyard and start to see these signals of climate change. Other examples are chipping sparrows and hooded warblers, which are shifting their ranges, and also the rusty blackbird. This is a bird that's actually losing large parts of its range because of climate change. It's lost the majority of its southern half of its breeding range because of changes in different climate components. So I want to talk a little bit more about the distributions because this is what the rest of the talk I'm going to be focusing on. And so I want to just very quickly talk about how climate affects where a species can live. This is just going back to some old biology and ecology textbooks of mine, but this is the law of tolerance. Essentially, it's just showing you that there's sort of this like bell curve shape where you see in the middle of the plot, you have the most fish. And so that's the abundance of organisms. So we have the most fish in this optimum range of temperature because the conditions are ideal for it. It's able to survive there. As you get to lower temperatures or higher temperatures, it actually gets either too hot or too cold for them, and they're physiologically stressed to the point where they cannot survive there. They can't breathe there, they'll die there. And so you have fewer and fewer of these individuals the further you get away from that optimal. And so if you think about the landscape, if you go outside, you have a certain set of temperature and precipitation that's considered your climate. Every single species that you see, plants and animals, they're there because they've evolved to be within that optimal range of the climate that occurs in your area. And so an example of this is the eastern phoebe. This is an older study, but I think it shows a really good example of how these physiological limits can limit where a species occurs. And so there's this -4°C average minimum temperature. They call it an isotherm, but essentially this is like a line where it shows you where -4°C in January is on average. That's the average minimum temperature. So above that it's colder, below that it gets warmer. And this is just a map of abundance in the Christmas bird count for the eastern phoebe. So the lighter pink is lower abundance, white is no birds there, and then the darker pink, the brighter pink, that's high abundance. And you can really see that 4°C line on the top left matches on the bottom right where you stop seeing phoebes. You stop seeing them north of there. And then south of there, the further you get away from that line, the more abundant that species is. And so this is how you can directly translate climate and climate conditions to on a map, looking at how it affects where a species can and cannot occur. So this is a study that looked at just that. It looked at these areas of abundance. Where are the highest abundances of these birds, and how has that changed over time? And so this is looking at the 1960s, the Christmas bird count data from the 1960s through to the early 2000s. And what they found was that the majority of species have shifted their range, and not just the edges of their ranges, it's the center of abundance. It's the most optimal place for that species has changed dramatically in that time period, with some species like the purple finch shifting 433 miles. That's a huge shift for that center of abundance. And it's happened as our winter temperatures have gotten warmer. And so we're seeing these changes in distributions already. Because of this, we like to say that birds are messengers and that birds are telling us about climate change. They're intimately tied to the world around them, and by looking to them as messengers, we can see that things are changing in our world. And so I wanted to highlight this, that climate change is not just a future problem. It's something we're right in the middle of. It's something that's been happening for a while, but it's going to continue to get worse. And so global temperatures will continue to rise, especially if we don't do anything. I've given you here on the left, these are the 3 different scenarios of temperature change. What we're looking at here, the trajectory we're on, is somewhere between the bottom 2, closer to the bottom right one. So the really bright red map is saying that we're going to have more than 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer conditions in the future if we stay on the climate change path that we are currently on. And I've been talking a lot about temperature. I also want to highlight that it's more than temperature, it's also precipitation. And so here are the patterns of precipitation change that we might expect in this higher scenario, where brown means more drought and green means more rainfall. Some areas are going to be experiencing more extreme droughts, and areas in the Midwest and the Northeast are going to be experiencing more heavy precipitation events in the future. So there was another report that came out in the fall that talked about 1 in 4 birds are gone since 1970. We've lost nearly 3 billion birds due to different environmental factors, habitat change, window collisions, pesticides, cats, climate change, all sorts of things mixed together. So we're already at a point where our wildlife is changing because of our presence in the environment. Our report that we put out, 389 bird species on the Brink, shows us that climate change poses a really big threat to birds. It's the 5th alarm in a 5-alarm fire. So when we pivot to the future, we have this loss that we've already experienced in the past. It means that these birds are much more at risk into the future. And so in order to do this study, we brought together 140 million bird observations. And so these are individual data points where somebody has seen a bird in a particular location. And this can be anybody from a scientific researcher to a community scientist that goes out there and collects their own data from eBird. So we pulled it from 70 different data sources to really collate one of the largest data sets on birds in North America to study the impact of climate change on birds from all these diverse sources. This is just a snapshot here of where we have occurrence from. So in order to understand where these birds occur, how it's related to the environment, we also included different environmental features in our models. And so here are some of the examples that we use. So we use climate. So we have climate data at a full North America extent at a 1-kilometer resolution that includes different factors of both temperature and precipitation, several different factors as our measure of climate. We also use human land use, because I talked earlier about how the habitat has changed can really have an effect on birds. And so here we're looking at areas that are natural habitats versus non-natural habitats like cities or agricultural fields. We also look at broad vegetation change. So how are these broad vegetation biomes anticipated to change with climate change? And then with certain species, we have specific variables, like for water birds, we have here is the presence of water, so surface water across North America. And so we take this information, we take the data of where we see the birds, so each of these occurrence points, and then we relate it to the specific environmental information that we have at that location and model the species range. So the species range, here is an example with the wood thrush, is where we expect to see that species based on the combination of climate, vegetation, land use, all of these factors. And the model uses that information to map where that species range is, very similar to what you might see in a bird field guide. So this is the current range of the wood thrush. Then, in order to understand how climate change is going to affect that species range, we have to project it onto our climate change scenarios. So for this, for this report, we looked at 3 different scenarios. We looked at 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, and 3 degrees Celsius. And so these are the different scenarios that we picked because we are already around that 1 degree Celsius warming mark that I had mentioned earlier. The Paris Agreement goal is the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is really the best case scenario that we really would hope to be able to stabilize climate change at if we can take action now. 2 degrees is another scenario that looks like it's probably a more realistic goal at this point, since we haven't taken the action we needed to since the Paris Agreement. And then finally, there's a 3 degrees Celsius, which is sort of this business as usual, not changing our policies, not changing actually the current pledges and targets that the different countries have put, they've put for themselves within the Paris Agreement, has us around 3 degrees Celsius or more. And so this is the framework of our study to look at these different scenarios. And I do want to highlight that people say, well, what's the big deal with half a degree? It's actually a really big deal. So this is just looking at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. If we don't keep it at 1.5 degrees, there's 2.6 times more extreme heat, 10 times more sea ice loss, 0.06 meters more sea level rise, and also a lot worse for species and ecosystems. So 2 to 3 times loss in species, changes in ecosystems and permafrost in really unprecedented rates. So that half a degree makes a big difference. So here is our wood thrush again. You can see the current range of the species on the left, and then the 2 different future projections at the 1.5 degrees Celsius and the 3 degrees Celsius. So if we look at 1.5 degrees Celsius, what we're looking at is areas in red are areas that are going to be lost. They're no longer going to be suitable based on climate and habitat. Areas in blue are areas that were not suitable, but will or could potentially become suitable for that species because the climate and vegetation conditions are improving there for them. We don't know if that species is going to be able to establish themselves in these new areas because it could interact with another species negatively. It might not have the right site features. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And then we have these orange areas, which are slightly worsening, and green areas, which are improving. But the big thing to note is the difference between 1.5 and 3 degrees Celsius. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, the species is considered low vulnerability to climate change. However, at 3 degrees Celsius, the species is considered highly vulnerable to climate change, and it loses a large portion of its range because the conditions have become not suitable for them there. And so this is just how the different scenarios, how it cycles through when we look at current 1.5 degrees to 2 to 3 for this particular species. And so what we did across all 604 species is look at how much of this species range, each species range was going to be lost from climate change versus how much species ranges could potentially gain in new areas. And when we looked across all 604 species, we found that 2/3 of North American birds were at risk of extinction or lots of range loss because of climate change. And so that's a lot of species, 389, that are going to be negatively affected by climate change, particularly if we don't do anything to curb greenhouse gas emissions. This includes 1/4 of state birds could lose the majority of their range in one season at 3 degrees Celsius. So that's a state completely losing their state bird. We looked at different habitat groupings, and so I just wanted to highlight that some areas and some groups are more at risk than others. So the Arctic and the Boreal were our most vulnerable groups, and this makes sense because climate change is happening a lot faster. The closer you get to the poles, the more rapid the pace of climate change. So it's not surprising that these species are most at risk. But most of our groups have more than 50% of their species vulnerable, including western forests, water birds, subtropical forests, grasslands, eastern forests, and coastal species. So I want to highlight that this is just a snapshot of some of the birds that Audubon focuses on, but 50 of the species that we looked at are climate vulnerable and also of conservation concern. They already have some other aspect of their environment that's at risk, or their populations are going down. And so there are quite a few species that are already threatened or endangered that we have this added risk on top now with climate change. It's also going to be an emerging threat for the species that are not currently on the conservation of need list. However, I do want to pivot to the science that shows that there is hope, that there is good news. If we can do something now, if we can start to take actions at the state level, at the national level, at the individual level, that we can make a difference. So if we can hold and stabilize climate change to a global 1.5 degree scenario, then we improve the chances for 76% of these species. They will have a lot less range loss in this scenario. And so this is a map where you can see side by side the two different scenarios. And red is loss of species at a particular location. And so you can see from much of the breeding season across North America, we have a lot of red. It's much more pronounced at the 3 degree scenario. Areas in blue, you can see that species are shifting northward. They're trying to escape the heat. But eventually there's going to be nowhere else for them to go. There's nowhere north of this that they can really move to. And so it just shows that it's pretty dramatic across most of North America. But stabilizing climate change will make a difference. So I just want to take a pause here because there's a lot of numbers and a lot of maps, but going back to what I said when I first started, this is also about your sense of place. And so for me, the common loon is my connection to nature. It's my connection to my family. I used to spend my summers in Wisconsin and hear the common loon with my grandparents. I've since taken my 5-year-old daughter. And when I first started looking at these models, I realized that the common loon was no longer going to be breeding in the lower 48 states. Its range was going to shift completely north into Canada, and it's considered vulnerable to climate change. And so I want you to think about the birds that you are connected to, or nature that you're connected to, and things that you share with your family or your friends, and realize that it's more than just numbers. It's these changes in nature as we know it. So the next thing we did is we looked at, so we looked first at the range shift, like how birds are going to have to shift their ranges to keep within those ideal conditions that they like, what about in the places that they're staying in or the places they're moving to? So just because it might have the right habitat and climate doesn't mean that they're going to be safe in. And so both birds and people are at risk to these other climate change related threats. And so we looked at some of our some other climate change related threats, including sea level rise, urbanization, cropland expansion, and then different measures of extreme events like heat, drought, fire weather, heavy rains, and false springs. So this is just looking at the maps. These are the areas that are going to be affected by these different threats and the different scenarios. So the brighter the red is sort of additive to the lighter orange. The lighter orange is the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and then the brighter orange is the 3 added on top of that. So you can see some of these threats are going to be affecting large parts of the country. And when we look at these together, what we found was that 305 bird species will face 3 or more threats at 3 degrees Celsius. However, if we stabilize things at 1.5, 34 are going to be facing 3 or more. And so any one of these threats individually can be really dramatic, affecting negatively bird species, people, but we're going to be seeing multiple threats on top of each other, particularly at this 3 degree scenario. And this is us looking at a map. You can see the different scenarios. So the brighter the red or the darker the red it gets here, the more of these threats you're going to be seeing in one given location. And so multiple threats, particularly at 3 degrees. And so up to 57 of the species we looked at are going to be affected by 4 or more threats, including these 14 species. Very much to note are coastal species. There is a group going to be facing the highest number of threats, in particular sea level rise and urbanization, where it's going to really squeeze out habitat for these species and they're not going to have a lot of places left to go. So the takeaway, when you look at the climate change range shifts, in addition to the threats, every single species, all 604 species we studied, was going to be affected by climate change. No species is going to miss out on the effects of climate change. And that means no place either, because these birds cover across North America. And so birds and people alike are going to continue to experience climate change into the future. And this is just highlighting which areas are most at risk in the different seasons based on where there are multiple threats, where there are many bird species, and where there are many vulnerable species. And so certainly something to think about into the future. So shifting gears a little bit, we know what we need to do. We need to protect birds in the places they need now and in the future. And then we do need to take personal actions at home, but we also need to take action at a state and federal level to address the root causes of climate change. And so the first thing I want to highlight is that because birds are so ubiquitous, because they are so tied to their environment, they really take climate change, they take this abstract global concept and make it personal, they make it local. And so it's a way that you can see climate change happening in a very tangible way. We have a website, climate.audubon.org, or you can Google survival by degrees. And once you get in there, you can find out a little bit more about what is happening in either your state or your particular county. So you can search by your zip code or by your state, and it will give you information about what is going to happen to the birds in your neighborhood. And so I just pulled out some information about birds and climate in Missouri and Kansas. This is just a snapshot of what the website looks like. So in your area, 13 species are highly vulnerable in summer, 27 are moderately vulnerable. It gives you the images of the birds that are in each category. You can click on it and you can find out more. You can go and look at its range. So here, looking at red-headed woodpecker, you can see this is the range-wide change for this species. So this species is highly vulnerable to climate change. It loses 94% of its range. It does have the opportunity to move into new areas, but I do want to, this is zooming into Missouri and Kansas. It's red across the board. This species is going to be completely lost from these states if we don't do anything about climate change. This is the 1.5 degree scenario. So there's a little bit more yellow in there, which means stable. So that means that if we do something, that there's a chance that the species might not shift out of these areas. And I'm just gonna show you a couple more species here: scarlet tanager, American goldfinch. So these are, it's not even just the rare species, it's also common species that we see every day, like American goldfinch, eastern towhee, field sparrow, and hairy woodpecker. So this one's interesting. This is a species that gains a large amount of range in new areas and is not considered vulnerable to climate change because it can make up for these in new areas, but it's just a question of whether it's going to be able to establish themselves there. So each one of these birds is a unique role in the ecosystem, and each of them is threatened by climate change. I do want to pull out that on this tool, you can also look at which threats are going to be affecting your area, and you can actually use your mouse to hover over a location and it'll tell you which threats in that particular area. But in Kansas and Missouri, the main threats are going to be increased urbanization, extreme spring heat, increased fire weather, and more false springs. So false springs are when you have like a very mild warm spell in winter and the plants start to leaf out, and then you have a cold snap and it kills all the vegetation. And that's very bad for crops, but it's also very bad for wildlife, particularly birds, because when the plants die back, also the insects do as well. However, at 1.5 degrees Celsius, you can see there's a lot less threat in your particular area. So that's really good, because that's also affecting people. So Audubon put out this special report. If you don't get the magazine, I would highlight that it's a fantastic issue, and it raises the point that birds can't fight climate change, but we can. And so I want to take a couple of minutes here just to talk about what Audubon is doing and what you can do about climate change. So Audubon has a two-pronged strategy to approach climate change. The first is addressing what I said, like protecting places the birds need now and into the future. So that's climate adaptation. And then also addressing the underlying cause of climate change, the root of climate change. This is what we call climate change mitigation. So in terms of adaptation, we're focusing on different strategies. We're focusing on coasts, on water, on grasslands, forests, and working lands, and on bird-friendly communities. So we're doing things like our conservation ranching program, where we're working with ranchers to graze their cattle in a way that is good for the landscape, it's good for birds, and it also helps with carbon sink. So it's actually good for both adaptation and mitigation. We're looking for different ways that we can restore habitats that are going to give birds resilience, or areas that we can protect to help birds kind of cope with the amount of climate change that's inevitable. Mitigation, I'm not going to get into these. There's a lot of information in our report if you want more information about each of these specifically. But we're looking for economy-wide solutions. We're looking to shift to 100% clean electricity. We're looking for natural climate solutions. So this is naturally storing carbon and providing things like planting forests, restoring wetlands, that conservation program, ranching program I was talking about. These are ways that we can naturally pull some carbon out of the atmosphere. Energy efficiency for buildings, homes, and industry, clean transportation, and innovation. Just want to highlight, we have this up on our website. It shows the climate policy in each state. So this is Missouri. Currently, Missouri is 4.1% renewable, 9.8% nuclear, and 86.1% fossil fuels. So you can look a little bit more. There's no greenhouse gas emission targets for the future. Kansas. This is the Kansas portfolio, a little bit more renewable and energy and nuclear, so a little bit less fossil fuel dependence, lots of wind turbines. And then I want to highlight that there is this online, Audubon has a climate action guide where you can look at all these different ways that you personally can help. And so I would really urge you to take a look here. I'm just going to touch base on a couple of them, but I think that there's a lot of information for somebody who's really interested in taking action personally. So information on how to write a letter to an editor. I think one of the key things we can do is lobby our legislators. We really need at the state, local, and federal level to let them know that this is an issue that we're concerned about. There's this really cool little map that talks about like what you can do locally, like such as adjusting your thermostat at work or packing your own lunch, getting more vegetarian meals. It doesn't have to be 100% vegetarian, but maybe a little bit more in schools, changing light bulbs, composting, one thing is really cool is you can plant native plants, which is considered a co-benefit because you can put them in mediums and in parks, but they cut down water. You don't have to water them or mow them as much, and they act as a carbon sink and they mitigate rain runoff. So take a look at that action guide if you get a chance. There's a couple other things you can do. You can get involved with birds. Like I said, all of the data that I used here, a lot of it came from community scientists. So people that just go out there and look at birds. So you can get involved with birds. There's many opportunities. We do have a really cool program at Audubon called Climate Watch. And Climate Watch is meant to specifically track how birds are shifting with climate change. And the next survey is going to be in January. I do want to highlight, we have a scientific study that is just getting published on this that is looking at how birds are shifting their ranges, and across the board, the species that we have data for, they're showing us that they are shifting as our models are projecting into the 2020s. These birds are shifting their ranges as our models are predicting. Christmas Bird Count is another great program. A lot of people participate in this, but it is giving us information that species are shifting their ranges. This is looking at hairy woodpeckers and white-crowned sparrows. Areas in blue are where they're increasing, and areas in red are where they're decreasing. And so we can start to tease apart climate signals. Plants for Birds is another fantastic program. If you're into native plants or if you love plants in general, native plants are better for birds, and they're also better for people. They're great for climate change. This is an example of the High Line in New York City. You can really do native plants anywhere. And so I really, if you check it out, it'll tell you what native plants work in your area. It's the Plants for Birds program. And then lastly, I think you really need to get out there. It's time for us to be advocates for birds, to be their voice, to listen to what they're telling us, and to get out there and urge our elected officials that this is something we need to take action on now. And with that, I will turn it over to the questions. I need to change my view so I can see what everybody's doing. Great. So I'm going to go through the questions. So one of the questions is there evidence that bird species have undergone genetic mutation to adapt to climate change? So that is a great question, and I am not a geneticist, so this is not my field. This is something that I don't have a lot of experience in terms of the genetic component. I know I gave the example that birds are changing their body size, and so we don't know if that's just what they call phenotypic plasticity, where a bird is just able to sort of change its body because of the conditions, rather than actually just changing its genetics. And so I'm not sure. I can try to find some more information about that particular question, but thank you for asking it. Let's see. So I live in Independence, Missouri, and have recent sightings of pigeons on the rooftops of the buildings where I live, as well as what I believe to be Canadian mallards very near the pond outside my living room window. I'm wondering if pigeons are a species affected by climate change. I'm also curious about mallards. So this is a really good question. We did do the models for mallards. They are not vulnerable to climate change. So they have a lot of times, if you go back to the looking at the groups, our generalist group, which are widespread species that kind of occur in a lot of areas, they were one of the least vulnerable to climate change. And that's same with our urban suburban species. That's because they have broad tolerances and they can sort of live in many different areas. And so I think that for these species in particular, there are going to be some climate winners, species that do well, and species that are generalists or that are affiliated with human areas are really going to be able to do better. So I think they will be affected by climate change in some ways, but they sort of have these built-in protections by the nature of their behaviors and their ecology. So we have somebody who's a master's student in Australia. That's fantastic. I spent a lot of time in Australia. Oh, I lost that one. There it goes. So they're interested in migratory behavior. How can we best approach refugia planning for stopover sites, breeding grounds? Will protection of sites, taking climate change into account, preserve migratory behavior? So yeah, I think it's really good, important to think like holistically about a bird Here we are only looking at the breeding and the wintering grounds, but obviously birds are connected by migration. So it's really important to think about both where these stopover sites are going to be, as well as when they're migrating in terms of planning for this. And so we at Audubon are looking to identify key areas for birds with climate change. And then we also have a migratory bird initiative, which is one of our newer components of our science team here at Audubon, where we're looking just at that, like where can we plan for the best locations for birds with migration in mind, as well as with climate change. So we're definitely working on that. I think I'd love to hear more about what you're working on in Australia, because I have done a lot of work over there. So I'm just trying to get through these questions. So somebody would like to know about, could you tell us about the role of local bird watchers have played in this research, and how much historical data does the Audubon Society use for projections such as these presented here? So I will say that the role of local bird watchers has been huge in this research. The largest data set that went into this was from eBird. And if anybody is a local birder and you haven't used eBird, it's a really fantastic app that you can download on your phone, where if you go outside, you can see a bird, you can enter it, and it spits into the database, and then researchers like me can use it. And I like to say, as a scientist, I can be in one place, I can't be in multiple places. And so climate change is a landscape scale issue. It's happening everywhere. Me going out in my backyard by myself and counting my birds is not going to tell me how birds are affected by climate change. And so local bird watchers across the world have really helped us understand climate change and other global issues. So I cannot stress the importance of people going outside and counting birds. It's enjoyable, and it's something that really can provide meaningful information. And like our Climate Watch program, we are already showing scientifically, and it's in we're getting our paper out in the next week or so, that birds are shifting, and that's all volunteers that are out there collecting that data. How much historical data does the Audubon Society use? I'm not quite sure exactly what that question was, but the Christmas bird count data that goes back to the early 1900. So these are all data sets that we use for these programs and for these research studies to show. So it's really valuable to have these long-term data sets. So I will say that we do use a lot of that historical data for the projections here. What does eating meat have to do with climate change? I asked because a friend is a smallhold sheep farmer and seems to face criticism for being a meat farmer. So there's two things that have to do with meat and climate change. The first is habitat loss. And so when you have large grazing areas, you tend to convert the landscape to a different system than it was before. And particularly if you're not grazing in a way that kind of lets the land rest a little bit, you lose a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. And that's why I was talking about the conservation ranching program. They're working with ranchers, these are particularly cattle ranchers, to graze their cattle in a specific way that they let parts of the property rest. And so you can really store a lot more carbon, because the longer you let a field rest, the longer its roots can grow and more carbon can be stored. So that's one thing, the habitat loss and the loss of carbon. The other component is cattle in particular. I'm not exactly sure where sheep fit in this, because there's different species of, are different, but cattle are the biggest emitter of methane across the board. So a huge one, if you go back to some of my earlier slides, methane had they had a lot more of an effect than carbon dioxide did. And so because of the way cows eat and the way they digest, they emit a lot of methane into the air. And so that's one of our large greenhouse gas components. And so those are the two things why eating meat has to do with climate change, and why you can really make a difference if you eat less meat in your diet. So what type of opportunities for changes in human behavior might the current shutdown provide to improve the environment? That's a really good question. I mean, we are seeing across the board, I've seen photos from India where you see less pollution and you can see the mountains in the background. So I think we're learning that if we change our behavior, it can make a difference, and that there's a lot less pollution right now. So I don't think everybody is going to stay in place after this kind of goes away, but we do need to be mindful that it does make a difference, and also that we show that we are able to do this. We're able to come together and face a global threat. I mean, there are some parallels in the COVID-19 and climate change. It's not often that you have a threat that everybody on the planet is facing. Like, so we know we can do something, and I think that we need to learn about what certain things can be done. Like maybe more people can work from home. Transportation is a really big thing that we can work on in terms of curbing our emissions. So I certainly think that there will be a lot more discussions about this moving forward. Let's see. So I'm trying to figure out where to go here. So which state regions have done the best at addressing bird habitat? Oh, that's a good question. I have to do a little bit more research about which ones have been doing the best, in particular about bird habitat. I know in terms of climate change, some of the states that have been leading with climate change are New York and California. But I'd have to go back and look a little bit more about which states are addressing bird habitat specifically the best, because it is very local. It also depends on how many protected areas there are in each state. So that's a good question that I'm going to take back and hopefully get back to you on that one. Okay. Here in Northern Virginia and Mississippi, kites, including breeding pairs, have been observed in recent years. I presume this type of sighting, while unusual, is likely a result of global warming. What are my thoughts on this? Yeah, so I'd have to look at the model for that species in particular, but I do remember some of our southern, it makes sense, some of our southern species moving further north. And so you can go on our website. There's 604 species for me to keep track of, so I'm trying to remember this one particularly, but you can go there and you can see how the range shift is anticipated for that species. But the likely pattern is that species do shift from the south further north. So I think it could potentially, especially if you start to see them more and more, that could be a good case that climate change could be part of it. So somebody asked, most climate change projections I have read are based on an increase of up to 2 degrees. What your projections are on 3 degrees. So the projections that I've used are based on the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so they put out a report last year that talked about 1.5 degrees, which is where we hope to be. 2 degrees is what they're saying, okay, well, maybe we have to be a little bit more realistic. Maybe 1.5 degrees is too far of a reach at this point because we haven't taken enough action. But that's more of like a mid-century 2050s projection. The 3 degrees scenario that I was talking about is a conservative end of century scenario. So this is more 2080s to 2100. Some of the newer models show that that's actually more like 4 to 5 degrees Celsius globally. And so it's more of a difference between a mid-century and an end of century scenario. So that's what that's based on. I do want to highlight that 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, 3 degrees, these are all global scenarios. Within the US, the numbers are actually much higher than these global averages. So a 3 degrees warming globally means something more like 5.5 degrees in certain parts of the country Celsius. So that's just something to keep in mind. Somebody asked a good question: are wind turbines a positive or a negative for birds? This is a very difficult question, but from what we believe here at Audubon is that wind turbines are one of the better things that we can do for climate change. And if they are sited properly, meaning they're put in the proper locations and monitored, that you can have them be a beneficial thing in terms that they can fight climate change. Clean electricity is one of the best things we can do for climate change. Turbines do kill birds, and so we really need to be mindful, like I said, about where they're placed and when they're turned on. We can work to figure out when there's a peak migration period that maybe be a time to pause the wind turbines for a little bit. But the amount of birds that will be lost from climate change is far greater than the number of birds that are lost to wind turbines every year. So there are much greater threats to birds, which include window collisions, cats, and habitat loss. There are exponentially more bird loss from what I just mentioned than there is to wind turbines. So that's what I would definitely, I think that they're part of the necessary step to mitigating climate change. Let's see, there's still quite a few questions. Somebody asked if they could have a copy of this recording for their STEM students. I would be happy to share anything with you, so maybe somebody can connect us afterwards. Let's see. How will the cancellation of the breeding bird survey due to COVID-19 affect your data? That's a great question. There's been quite a few surveys that have been canceled. The great thing is that because these are such rich data sets that have been going on for so long, we are able to deal with a loss of a single year of data. It's not ideal, but the way that we can deal with it statistically is there's ways we can get around it. So it's unfortunate, but because the breeding bird survey goes back to the 1960s, Christmas bird count goes back to the 1900, if we get to the point where we can't do that survey. And there has been other times that we've lost data. So Christmas bird count during one of the world wars, I think we lost 1 year of data. And I've worked with breeding bird survey data on different studies before, and some routes stop, they pick up a couple years later, or they stop completely, and we're able to statistically deal with that. So it's sad, but it will be okay. Let's see. I'm not sure. There's a couple more ones to answer, and we're right about time. I might take the rest of these offline and answer people afterwards. I think we're at time now.
Yeah, we're up against the top of the hour, Dr. Bateman. So thank you so much for the wonderful lecture.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and some great questions. I'd love to be able to answer all of these.
Well, I'm glad we were able to still make it work.
Yes.
And to have everyone participate and hear the information that you presented in your lecture. Thank you also to everyone who was participating online. We had a question from Australia, Virginia, so we were definitely worldwide tonight. So thank you so much for tuning in, and go to lindahall.org for more information about our upcoming programs, and visit the National Audubon Society's website for their climate report and a lot of other resources. So thank you again, Brooke, and thank you everyone, and please stay healthy, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.